Previously on Jishogi.
Are we a lesbian? Oh my fucking god, we are a lesbian! Bro, I can't believe I was right. What are you talking about? There's no way this is... I was only joking! I must calm the fuck down. Okay, enough. What? This is like when Frollo sings that one song about having a boner. You probably shouldn't get too close. But lesbians, it's your deepest desire. Oh my god.
And now, back to needing therapy.
Hello, and welcome back to Jishogi. I'm Karma, and I will be your friend and host this evening. Oh my god, last time shit happened. We saw what the incident in Mayu's life was. And we also learned about her deepest desire, which caused poor Fifield to explode. We've seen evil Mayu wanting to use the situation, I would say abuse the situation, but anyway. And now we're here. So let's get to it. Oh boy. Okay. This is it. You can feel something on the other side of this now. You don't really know what you're doing, but you should be able to push through it. Enter. Yes, okay. Let's enter. Oh my. Rainbows. Does this go on forever? It can't. There's no way. The sun is changing direction. Does this actually lead somewhere, or am I just... Oh, it does lead somewhere. I feel like I shouldn't be here. I didn't even... I think I know what it is. The other one was ours, and this one belongs to Fifield. I see. It would seem that you've arrived in Fifield's mind. Everything is going smoothly. You try to explore for now. It seems like Fifield is distracted. It's an excellent opportunity. You can't let this go to waste. You decide to get going. It's how you got here. The doors you entered have disappeared. Did they ever exist at all? Either way, it's too soon to go back now. How about I do anyway, because I want to see what that was. Oh, I can't actually interact with it. Alright. Time to walk back, I guess. It's interesting how Fifield's mind is a castle made of chess pawns, and ours is like a classic, what are they called? I was gonna say Dakota, and then I was like, no, that's not it. That's an actress. Oh, Pagoda. That's it. Yeah, with Shogi. And we do have the appropriate hairpins as well. Ours is Shogi piece, whereas hers is chess queen, or a witch, as they called it in the knowledge. It's a fountain of shimmering green fire. There's a lot of fire in this, huh? Why do you have statues of yourself in your mind? I can't interact with these. Can't interact with this green thing either. The door is marked hobbies and interests. You try to access the trial, but it doesn't seem like you can. It's different to how you accessed your own. You can't seem to do anything here. The door is marked hopes and desires. You try to access the trial, but blah, blah, blah. The door is marked sexuality. What? There's just a door for sexuality? Oh, is that what ours was? Ours was at this part of our mind castle as well. You couldn't even read what it was. It was marked with all these, I don't know what they're called actually, I don't remember. Tried to access it, but tough luck. The door is marked relationships. It seems like, these doors, right? They sound like something that Mai would want to know about Fifield. So perhaps this manifestation of the castle is as much a manifestation of Fifield's mind as it is Mayu's, because we're connected at this point. The door is marked memories. There's no trial here, enter. Can't interact with these. Is there something here? You think you can detect a trial, but it doesn't look like there's anything you can do here right now. Okay. Door is marked school life. You try to access a trial, but as if. Door is marked midterm memory. The door is marked home life. Okay, well, what now? I guess we're not able to do any of this? Oh. Huh. There's definitely something here. The door is marked knowledge. It seems to be unguarded. Enter. Yeah, because there was a green carpet there. Can interact with these. It's some kind of knowledge. You absorb it. Received knowledge. O-N-M misc spells? Oh great, are we gonna have her powers now as well? Some kind of knowledge, you absorb it. The ego's form and strength. Huh? You absorb it. O-N-M aspects. What is O-N-M? Which culture? Okay, let's read these. O&M aspects. As mentioned before, the spell is an extremely complex thing. The modern variant is woven from 5 aspects, each important and difficult in their own right. You can remember these with the acronym SALAM: Shackle, Absolute Territory Barrier, Landscape, Ego, and Mental Link. Although doing so puts them in reverse order. Okay. The first aspect to begin with is the mental link. Much as the name implies, this connects you with your target and is the conduit through which all things move. While these links can be surprisingly resilient and even formed over long distances, they can be troublesome while awake. The brain struggles to deal with both its normal senses and any other sensations coming through the link. And while things like basic telepathy can be focused on easily, witches should lie down in a safe space to cast a spell, and the target should always be under some kind of sleeping spell, if at all possible. The second aspect is the absolute territory barrier, the walls that keep the two minds separate. Historically, the aspect had not bad. Historically, this aspect had many other names, such as the thorns, the hedges, and the barrier, but ATB is the commonly accepted modern term. This aspect is, of course, what results in trials being formed and is necessary to prevent, or more accurately to slow, the process of blending. Rather than speak of the ATB itself, it is simpler and easier to look at the very primitive versions of the spell that did not have it. With this version, only incredibly brief visits could be made to any person's mind, and even these had consequences for both parties. Weaker versions that seek to separate things while removing the trials are notoriously unreliable and dangerous. In addition to this, people who have been blended before or otherwise have extremely weak egos or identity problems may result in aberrations in the spell, such as a failure for the barrier to form, or in some especially bizarre cases of multiple personalities, the creation and reinforcement of additional mindscapes. All of these scenarios are rare, but suffice it to say, the ATB is perhaps the most essential component of the spell. Kind of like Maya's brain, which seems to have 3 personalities, or at least 2 alters and, Mayu. The third aspect is the mindscape, or in terms of the acronym, the landscape. Here, the spell uses magic to give form to the human mind, scanning it, interpreting it, and building a place out of it that allows for more effective exploration than what is possible with thought alone. The drawback, or benefit, is the malleability of the mindscape. It is, in some ways, literally the mind, and changes exerted on it will feed back into the minds of the subjects themselves. But without further stabilization, it is often too malleable, and both minds must be stabilized, or else neither will be. I see. So essentially, we could both go crazy. The fourth aspect is the ego. If the mindscape is literally the mind, then what is the ego? In truth, the ego, in terms of the spell at least, is something like a copy or a magical construct. While an ego is obviously linked to a mind, trying to attack the ego directly does not result in any feedback that will damage the mindscape itself. But of course, attacking the mindscape can and will affect the ego. In that sense, it can be thought of as a one-way connection, or something like a hologram or projection of the mind itself. Witches can often find this concept confusing, but one only needs to think about it for a while before it makes sense. As to the concept of forming an ego for yourself and not the subject, while this can be done, it is often beneficial to the witch to have an ego for the subject too, so such asymmetrical procedures have few real-world applications. Finally, we have the shackle. The shackle is generally the only part of the spell that is asymmetrical, and as the holder of the shackle, the witch has control. Out of all of the aspects of the spell, the shackle is that one that has historically proven to be the biggest obstacle to the spell's unusefulness. Many painful and more controlling shackles have been attempted, but shackling is a delicate art, and such brute force methods often resulted in weakening of the ATB, greater ease of breaking free, as well as more disastrous consequences if broken. One important thing to note about the common shackle, however, is that it does not prevent spellcasting, nor the use of magic in general. Because of this, it is trivially easy for another witch to break out of it, even if they have no prior oneiromantic experience. Anti-magic shackles exist, but suffer the same issues that all intrusive shackles do, and are so risky as to not be worth it. Realistically, the only chance that a witch has of brainwashing another witch is if the target in question is incredibly null-minded, a rather rare condition to say the least, and even then, it is not impossible for them to fight back. Is there gonna be like a twist that Mayu is also a witch, but maybe she doesn't know about it? I want to read what the ATB is again. Absolute Territory Barrier. Okay. O&M misc spells. This appears to be a bunch of spells, miscellaneous ones for things like digging into certain parts of the mind, blocking emotional feedback from memories, etc. One, however, catches your eye. The delayed approach. only used as a last resort. The delayed approach is the final gambit of a witch in a separate situation. It carries at least some risk and is more a way of mitigating a disaster than any kind of truly effective tactic. This spell essentially requires the witch to meditate, focusing greatly on the link and any blending. By tweaking things just right, she can form bubbles around each mind that reduce blending, while also pulling the two minds closer together, shortening the time until disaster. The end result is that blending is delayed in the short term, but if things go on for too long, the collision of the two minds will result in a truly horrific amount of mental damage to both parties. Yeah, it seems like one of these endings is gonna be us turning into crazy people or not knowing who we are anymore, because it will just be so blended. In a counter-invasion scenario that has gone terribly wrong, this can be desirable. It lessens the amount of time that the invader can attack the witch's mind and will help prevent blending so long as the spell is exited correctly. Moreover, the effect can look quite spectacular, and the invader should be able to understand at a glance what is happening. So by creating a greater, more visible threat of mental damage, they can be coerced into leaving more effectively. Needless to say, this is not a particularly useful spell. Its application is terribly narrow, and the one situation in which it is useful is a terrible one, no matter what happens. Still, many paranoid witches learn this spell. It is not particularly hard to do, even if it does require unbroken concentration, and at the end of the day, it is often felt that it is better to be safe than sorry, even for an event as incredibly unlikely as a full counter-invasion, which is what's happening right now. So we can safely assume that Fifield right now is meditating to try and recreate that bubble. The ego's form and strength. The ego is a concept that is easy to understand, yet hard to explain. It is the self, or at least one avatar of the self. Anything that is present in one's psychoscape is always, for better or worse, part of the self. But the ego is a very special partition. It is the eyes, ears, hand, and feet of one's will, or at least the conscious elements of it. When an ego is formed in the context of the spell, it is much the same, but also a little different. Most people do not consciously form or shape an image of themselves, instead simply finding themselves in one particular form when exploring the psychoscape. This form is, in most cases, the body of the person in question, but wearing clothes, depending on a variety of factors. For witches, they most commonly appear in their sorority regalia, but for normal people, it's mostly a reflection of how they dress in real life, or how they would like to. Okay. So this is why Mayu's altars are dressed like that in her mind. The strength of the ego is also a curious thing. In the context of the spell, it is generally something that only matters in hostile invasions, and unless the ego of the invaded is many times stronger than that of the witch, there will likely be no problems. It is important to remember that the spell can be influenced by the strength of one's mind, even with no magical ability to back it up, but the shackling aspect generally prevents such things. Likewise, the shackle is also much stronger when the witch's will is strong. As such, even a normal mind will do for oniromancy. It is still preferable for an onironaut to have a strong ego. The added security is helpful, especially for the hostile invader, and even in more therapeutic cases, a strong presence can often help reassure or cajole a weaker mind into listening to the witch's counsel. And in moments of panic, a strong mind can often make up for a temporary lapse in control or power. Witch culture. This knowledge seems to pertain to a lot of things related to witches. Most of it is things you already knew, but there are a few things that stand out. Witches all have a signature magic, which can quite literally act as their signature. This can be something like green fire, in Fifield's case, but many more creative illusions and other such things can be produced. Even more important than that is the concept of the witch regalia. This is a special costume that is custom designed by and unique to each witch and is often worn in formal situations. Apparently, this thing is so important that they even offer fashion and costume design classes in witch schools. That's funny. That's funny and cute. Witches sometimes inherit regalia from their mothers, usually editing it slightly, but not all witch families follow this tradition. Still, albums of old family members and their regale are usually kept in witch families to inspire their future generations. That's adorable. Witches rarely get into any sort of fight or duel. Such infighting is greatly discouraged, and historically, many witches swore oaths to never fight another witch, or to never kill anybody in general, as any witch who took assassination work was usually swamped by it and led onto a darker path. Witches have a variety of magical sports and exercises, many of which are sort of equivalent to magical arm wrestling, which can help them sort out their frustrations with each other in a civil manner. This lore is so surreal. Witches also have some other cultural practices which may seem alien to outstanders. In particular, it is very common for witch parents to lead their children's minds to check for poor behavior. Like many things in parenting, it is sadly common for a young witch to swear that they will never do this to their own child, only to find themselves eventually resorting to it anyway, as the frustrations of parenting start to dawn on them. Cute. That was so long. O&M intro. Okay, I guess I read that in the wrong order. Oniromancy, literally the manipulation of dreams. Yeah, I was about to say, oniro in Greek, it means dream, so. Oniromancy, literally the manipulation of dreams, is a discipline old enough to have earned its Greek name legitimately. Oh, it says it. Okay, whoops. In the days of old, people believed that the mindscapes created with the primitive versions of these spells were simply dreams, albeit extremely vivid and realistic ones. And back then, they may as well could have been. The first versions of the spell were only safe when conducted between two witches, as attempts to change a person's mind were too risky to ever be viable. The spell quickly evolved, however, and enough refinements and barriers were put in place that a witch could enter a normal person's mind without the risk of destroying it or becoming too blended. Things developed further still, and after a rather long and bloody phase, where more violent and painful methods of shackling were attempted, it finally settled into something close to what we have today. The spell is vaguely named due to an extremely long debate about what it was, and then eventually what it should be called. In other circles, it is only referred to as oniromancy, therapeutic oniromancy, interrogative oniromancy, or mind invasion. But these terms are not terribly accurate. Oniromancy is both a single spell and an entire discipline at once, making it somewhat unique among magics. For ease of reference, we merely call it the spell, but in reality it is many sub-spells and tools that are often cast together as a whole. The spell is a complex and dangerous thing, but the benefits of oniromancy make it well worth it. On the therapeutic side of things, onironauts can do much. Mental disorders are classified by what the onironaut can do for them, with Class 3 disorders, anxiety, addictions, personality disorders, and more, being totally fixable. Class 2 disorders, psychopathy, schizophrenia, bipolar, et al., having beneficial long-term treatments. Only a very few Class 1 disorders, those caused by or causing severe mental retardation, remain incurable. So technically we could fix, not that it's an issue, but if Maya wanted it, she could remove the other voices in her head. But I mean, of course, it's a coping mechanism, so it may not be the best thing to remove it. Likewise, oniromancy can be used against a subject's will in a variety of ways. This is mostly for forensic purposes, which help make our society a safe place for everyone, but other applications exist. Sometimes mental health treatments may have to be enacted without the target's consent, especially when they have extreme paranoia problems or or are unable to understand their own aberrant behavior. Finally, various brainwashing techniques can sometimes be employed, usually in cases where a criminal is highly valuable to society or as an expensive alternative to the death penalty, if the criminal is wealthy or otherwise fortunate enough to have somebody who's actually willing to pay out for them. Stranger treatments also exist. Oniromancy can change a person's sexuality itself, and even potentially their relationships with people. Struggling couples can be made to fall in love again. Sexually deviant individuals may normalize themselves, or in some cases wish to strengthen their deviancy. And the witch can, of course, force an otherwise unwilling target to fall in love with them. This last one is not actually legal, but sadly it does happen regardless, and the husbands of Onironauts are sometimes treated with skepticism as a result. Alright. It should be noted, however, that every act mentioned here is rather expensive, and most costing the patient or the taxpayer more than a brand new automobile would. Oniromancy is always in extremely high demand, and so it is particularly lucrative, even compared to other magical careers. In the end, while some people may claim that oniromancy is doing some kind of harm to society, the reality is that, much like the magiplasty, most of the more private and personal treatments are quite rare, and the more medical and forensic applications are the bulk work of the average Onironaut. That's a lot of information. O&M trials. Trials are an extremely important part of oniromancy. Oh my god, there's 10 pages to this. A very large part of an oniromancer's work is solving trials, either by themselves or by guiding the subject through it. Even when the subject is consenting, trials will still prove to be a barrier, although in that case the difficulty is generally lower. It should be noted that while a witch can break through a trial with brute force, these attempts can be quite costly in terms of mana and may serve to destabilize the spell as a whole. Which I assume is what happened, is why Fifield blew up. Because she was like, oh, I'm gonna use, this is just the 1% of my power, and then she explodes. So yeah. Trials are mental barriers that are erected by the subject's subconscious. In layman's terms, the less that somebody wants some aspect of themselves to be known, the stronger the trial will be. There are many factors that can affect this, and it's important to note that in many cases a trial will be put up around things that the subject knows about themselves but doesn't want to admit. Another large factor is how much the subject wants the witch to know. In cases of interrogations, trials will generally be stronger, and very strong ones will be put up around that which the subject is trying to hide. Likewise, subjects that are embarrassing to everybody, such as sexuality, almost always have strong trials around them, even if there is nothing deviant or strange about the subjects. Trials are given form by two things, the attempter and the subject. Generally, it is much simpler to explain this concept by example, so let us assume that we have a witch named Anna. Anna loves locks and has lockpicking as a hobby. Thus, the lockpicking is the form that any trial that she attempts will take, regardless of whose trial it is. The form of trials that one attempts is known as trial choice, and it is not something that a witch can change consciously. Considering that trial choice is always based on something that is familiar and comfortable to the attempter, however, there is little need to change it. Common trial choices include things like math problems, crosswords, and sports-based challenges, although, as with all trial choices, there will usually be strange twists on these concepts that are unique to the chooser. So if trial choice is unique to each attempter, what does the actual trial itself influence? Generally, it influences the difficulty, and certain themes may be added, depending on the person and whatever the trial is guarding. Some of these themes can be quite vexing, and no matter how good a witch is at their given trial choice, a tough trial will always twist itself in such a way as to be difficult. It is important to understand that these trials are only a spell-wrought representation of what is truly happening, a battle of wills between the attempter and the subject. A good way to think of them is like mines or knotted ropes that need to be undone. The mines are laid as the spell is formed and do not require any mental effort to maintain. And one should know that these are indeed an important part of the spell. Trials protect the witch casting casting it even more than they do for the subject. Trial-less versions of the spell are notoriously dangerous, incredibly likely to result in blending, and should never be attempted. In short, trials are a side effect of some of the barriers that are necessary to make the spell safe to cast. This also ties into why forcefully breaking them often destabilizes the spell, which is what happened earlier. As well as generally defensive nature, trials require conscious and subconscious permissions of the subject in order to be accessed. Witches may subvert this necessity in various ways, usually trickery, but for non-magical attempters, it is very unlikely for them to be able to gain access. This is another of the many ways in which trials are asymmetrically beneficial to the witch. When all these factors are taken together, it is generally preferred that the subject be guided or coerced into solving their trials themselves, if at all possible. The trials will generally be easier for them, although in the case of matters that are subject to self-delusion or something they cannot accept, it may actually be easier for the witch to undo it. Because of this, solving trials is important for both for therapeutic and forensic applications of oneiromancy. Finally, most trials cannot be failed, or rather failure simply results in the ego of whoever is solving them to be stuck there. If this happens to the witch, there is generally no choice but to escape by destroying the trial with force. This is another reason why trials are more helpful to the witch. While a counter-invasion scenario is incredibly unlikely, the inexperienced and non-magical subject has a good chance of failing and getting stuck in one, if they can even attempt their trials at all. My god, this is a lot of knowledge. O&M consequences of failure. Okay, this ought to be interesting. Oneiromancy. Oneiromancy, like most forms of magic, is not without inherent risk. The main spell that is used is complex, involving many elements, and many of those are there specifically to prevent these scenarios from happening. The young witch is taught how to do this, practices them well, and as such, all of these potential consequences are largely a thing of the past. But it's nonetheless important to understand them, lest you fail to appreciate what exactly is at stake. Mental degradation is quite rare, but in many ways is the worst thing that can happen. It directly results from large amounts of stress being placed on the mind, usually from an extremely violent witch, a poorly constructed spell, or as a side effect of blending. The rarity of these things happening, combined with the unethical nature of experiments on it, means that many of its mechanics are poorly understood. What we do know, however, is that the effects can include things like loss of cognitive capacity, erasure of memories, magic-induced mental illness, loss of self-control, and a whole host of other effects that can be induced by physical brain damage. Jesus. Naturally, the severity of these effects is dependent on exactly how badly things go wrong, but it's important to note that in many cases, the witch suffers just as much as the subject does. Blending, on the other hand, is more common than mental degradation, but can also be detected and averted much more easily. Blending results when the two minds in the spell start to collide too much, and is an inevitable consequence of the spell's nature. That is to say, no matter how skilled you are, any mental link between two people will result in blending if left for too long. The important part is understanding it, recognizing the signs of it, and leaving before it is too late. While a small amount of blending can be recovered from quite safely, this fact often leads to witches accidentally going too far. The proper thing to do is leave as soon as you feel it start to happen. Like the term implies, blending can result in the minds of the two parties mixing. Memories are the first thing to be lost or transferred, but more critical aspects such as knowledge, personality traits, hobbies, and personal feelings about people can also become muddled. In the absolute worst cases, the egos themselves may be damaged or lost, resulting in two people with conflicting minds who don't properly understand who they really are. These particularly severe cases typically result in the eventual suicide or lifelong institution of both parties. Small cases of blending are perfectly normal and tend to result more in mutual copying effect, more than real losses. Much like brain damage to a boxer, these injuries are relatively inconsequential on their own, but witches who are consistently poor at managing their oneiromantic discipline may eventually have to retire early. Oneironauts are very prone to déjà vu moments. brought on by these small blends, as are subjects who have been through many repeated romantic treatments. But for the prudent and skilled witch, this job will generally not result in the loss of anything important to them, even over a lifetime. The oniromancy, the counter-invasion scenario. Much like the threat, oh my god, 12 pages, seriously? Much like the threat of a great white shark attack, the counter-invasion scenario is something that is feared by many, though experienced by few. Almost all cases can be prevented by simple common sense, never going into the mind of somebody you know personally, never attempting the spell without the proper training and experience, and learning to avoid certain minds that may have aberrant defensive potential. As long as one follows these rules, the chance of the situation happening falls to almost zero. However, it's still helpful to understand these scenarios, if only to impress it upon you why these rules exist. Oh boy. And Fifield is not following any of these rules. The first stage of counter-invasion scenario is simply the loss of shackling aspect. There are several ways that this can occur, but all of them tend to relate to the same thing, a sudden emotional shock. This kind of outburst can cause instability in every part of the spell, but the shackling aspect is the most fragile. Additionally, if the witch begins to subconsciously doubt that their control over the subject is justified, or begins to panic over what might happen if they lose it, things can also result in the loss of the shackle. However, these situations are only likely to occur if you have some kind of significant emotional attachment to the subject. It is not so shocking to learn that a man has cheated on their spouse, but if the spouse is you, then maintaining your emotional balance may be next to impossible. In short, you should never attempt this. No matter how much a friend or family member begs you for some free or discounted treatment, you should never give in. Even friends of friends may still have shocking memories of the people you care about, so performing the spell even on them is inadvisable. And while therapeutic excursions are one thing, conducting a hostile invasion on a person you care or cared about is folly beyond folly. With all that aside, given that the shackling aspect only allows you to trap and move the subject's ego around, one might fail to realize its true importance. The shackling aspect is what keeps the subject from being able to access the witch's mind, and it's also the only real thing that the witch can use to guarantee the subject's cooperation. Something which is necessary to safely disengage the spell. To put it simply, after a loss of shackle, the subject gains the ability to play mental chicken with the witch, threatening them with mutual annihilation by refusing to leave. And while most non-magical persons would not think to do this, the general knowledge in a person's mind is almost never guarded. And thus these things can now easily be known to them, which is what's happening now. If you do find yourself in this situation, the first step is to attempt to figure out what the subject wants and if their threat is legitimate. Even without the shackle, you may still explore their minds, so this shouldn't be too difficult. If they really are willing to risk death simply to harm you, however, your options are limited. You may, 1. Attempt the unsafe disengagement spell immediately. No matter the risks that it carries, it is better than allowing the spell to blend your minds to completion. 2. Invade the subject's mind aggressively, threatening to destroy or change them if they do not cease. Against fantastic minds, see types of mind. This strategy is much less effective, but still somewhat viable. If the subject really is willing to take you down with them, then it's either these or give in to any demands that they may have. While destroying the subject's mind may seem like an easy choice, you should remember that this kind of behavior is catastrophic to stability and may result in backlash or blending anyway. The threat you pose is better used to negotiate than to destroy. Surprisingly enough, however, things can actually get worse than this. A counter-invading its subject simply gaining access to witch's mind is sometimes not a huge problem on its own. After all, they will not be able to attempt any trials, and thus will be locked out of everything that is important or alterable. In some cases, however, the counter-invader may be able to obtain permission to the witch's mind, or rather, an aspect of it. For witches who have fantastic minds, it is possible for their various different shades of the self in your mind to rebel against you and help the invader. Okay, does she feel that a fantastic mind? Is that what it's called? Yeah. Generally, this will only happen if you have some kind of great inner turmoil, self-doubt, attachment to the invader, or some other kind of neurose. Children, but teenagers especially, also tend to lack inner harmony, so attempting this spell at a young age may also increase the risk. But even should all these things go wrong, there is one last mental defense, the trials. Boy, oh boy, Fifield really did everything wrong. Everything she could have done wrong. It's almost like she didn't study about this. Really, Fifield? When a witch attempts a trial, or is simply overseeing one, she always has a way out. This is not true for the ego of a counter-invader. If they cannot complete a trial or have enough mental resources to get past one, they will simply be stuck there, and the witch should be able to negotiate from there. This last-ditch defense has saved some foolish young witches before, but it is not something that should be counted on. If a counter-invasion has really progressed to this level, there is quite a good chance that the counter-invader has some skill with solving trials already. In some cases, they may even have more experience solving trials than the witch themselves. If the witch is unlicensed, unpracticed, and has only ever made her subjects solve their own trials, this can be a very real possibility. Should it come to pass that the counter-invader can solve trials reliably, the true worst case scenario begins. If a counter-invader can both access and solve trials, then all is lost. Anything that a witch can do to a person, the invader may do to the witch. The ability or knowledge to cast magic is not a factor here. All of the mind-altering effects from the spell are part of the spell itself, drawn from the witch's magic and shaped by the ego's will. The counter-invader may have to be clever, jury-rigging emotional spikes or other tangible aspects of the mind into crude bursts of willpower. But while this is not true magic, as far as the spell goes, it might as well be. This process is largely instinctual, and as such it is foolish to hope that the invader will not figure it out. And once they do, the witch's mind is their plaything, unless a successful attempt is made to stop them. Much like the above, there are few options available to the witch in this situation. An unsafe disengagement is often less safe than normal here, as the witch's emotional turmoil may serve to disrupt it. If the counter-invader truly cannot be reasoned with, then intimidation may be the only way, and for that, assuming that they are not willing to attempt to destroy the opponent's mind and risk everything, there is one final thing: the delayed approach spell. Using this spell can minimize the amount of time that the invader has to cause havoc, and can help impress upon them the true extent of what can go wrong. But make no mistake, this is by no means a solution. It is merely a form of damage control, and not one that is likely to prevent much at that. It kind of seems like she's letting us read these things so that we're scared into not attacking her. Okay, gained knowledge, witch to witch. One of the many aspects of oniromancy that tends to confuse people is the nature of witch-to-witch applications of the spell. Many have pointed out that brainwashing witches would be a good punishment for many a misdeed, and it's not hard to see why. The difficulty of this, as well as that of imprisoning witches, makes it very hard to punish witches with anything other than fines, minor reprimands, or death. But unlike what many Mondai may believe, things are not this way because witches wish it to be. For starters, it is very easy for witches to cast counter magic against any spell that is affecting them. Attempting to forcefully break the spell itself is too dangerous to be worth attempting, but witches can very easily break free of most shackles, and even the ones that are specifically made for anti-spellcasting purposes can still be undone through sophisticated counter magic, trial and error spell attempts, or some combination of these two things combined with the raw strength of ego. In short, these kinds of forced oniromantic invasions will only work on witches who are extremely inexperienced, weak-willed, or null-minded. Few witches fall into any of these categories, and the ones who do still need to be caught and captured alive first, a feat which is notoriously unreliable in and of itself. In short, only young, fledgling witches are in any position to be brainwashed, and it is extremely rare for them to commit any act heinous enough to deserve it. Another difficult aspect of witch-to-witch oniromancy is the instability caused by previous oniromantic exploits. If any witch has ever been on either end of such a mishap, their mind may react adversely to another party trying to cast a spell on them, or with them forming abnormally difficult trials near the subject witch cannot solve, or even preventing the spell from properly forming at all. Even a relatively normal and correct and romantic experience can result in such difficulty, sometimes known as hardening of the mind. This hardening is something that is more of a danger and hindrance to anyone trying to cast a spell on the witch in question than it is to the witch themselves. Mental hardening will make it harder for the witch to explore their own mind or attempt to recall or modify anything within it, but the ability to practice the spell in other minds is largely unaffected by this. In the case of unromantic duels or other severe mishaps, this can lead to frustrating situations where no witch can undo the mental injury suffered by the other witch. This, of course, is yet another reason why safety is so important when it comes to the spell. A witch is always, at least on paper, able to heal themselves, but it is often incredibly difficult. Nobody else can help them, and many forms of mental damage will rob them of the knowledge, motivation, or willpower to even attempt it. Let's hope this is the last one. Mind levels. Mind levels are a piece of oneiromantic terminology that refers to very broadly the imagination of the person's mind. There are 4 major levels that are recognized. However, it is very important to understand that there are no hard lines or definitions. Every person's mind is different. There are always exceptions to everything, and these levels should be considered a spectrum more than anything. It is helpful for the oneironaut to divide them up, but at the end of the day such divisions are purely arbitrary. The first level is referred to as the null mind. This is the lowest mind level and the easiest for a witch to deal with. Null minds are typically extremely plain and are held by people who have almost no tendency to think or become lost in thought or fantasy. Null minds may even have difficulty manifesting an ego for you to speak or interact with, and in general have little resistance to your explorations beyond some basic trials. Do not make the mistake of thinking that this implies stupidity, however. Many smart people, and many witches even, may possess this type of mind. However, the witches that do have a null mind should give up on becoming an oneironaut. It is not impossible, but even therapeutic oneiromancy will be significantly more difficult for them, and interrogative invasions are out of the question. The second level is referred to as the normal mind. As the name implies, it is the most common type, and most people reside here. There is also relatively little to say about it as a result. Normal minds can easily project an ego, and their psychoscape is generally sensible and easy to navigate, though irregularities and obstructions may exist. Only very rarely will you encounter any form of figment here, and when you do, it is likely to prove that to be particularly potent. Witches who have normal minds are just fine for both kinds of oneiromancy, however. It is generally best for them to try to avoid invading fantastic minds. A fantastic mind holds much allure to many, though once again, do not make the mistake of thinking that it means intelligence. Fantastic minds are the most complex kind of mind, however, and are often highly obstructed with a psychoscape that reveals things unknown even to the bearer. Most significant, however, are their figments. Fantastic minds almost always have them, and unlike other minds, they can often cause trouble being able to act completely independently of the ego, conversing with the ego to calm them down or plan things out, actively fighting or trying to interrupt your spells, or more. However, this can also prove to be a weakness. Figments can disagree with the ego or other figments, and as such can sometimes be played off against one another. This peculiar aspect of the fantastic mind means that they can vary wildly in strength, dependent on the subject's internal unity. When figments can be made to fight, or one decides to help you, you can gain access to the trial with no permission needed from the ego at all. However, when figments are all in agreement, they can band together to help the ego, often raising the difficulty of negotiations. One other important thing to mention, however, is that figments cannot normally cross between minds, ever, nor can they solve trials or perform any kind of alteration on the mind. And this brings us to the other half of this mind, namely the fantastically minded witch and your own figments. Much as with the subject, they can be your own greatest strength or greatest weakness. Because of this, witches with fantastical minds are generally preferred for difficult invasions. Provided that witch in question has the unity to rely on them, they will make things practically impossible for a counter-invader. Though with internal turmoil, they may instead drastically worsen the counter-invasion scenario. In this case, it is a double-edged sword for a witch to bear a fantastic mind. However, there are additional strengths of ego that come with such a thing, and they are still the most naturally talented Onironauts. Lastly, the fourth classification is the aberrant mind. These minds are truly complete inner worlds, held only by those who spend more time in fantasy than they do in their real lives. These vary massively and are only held by extremely strange individuals. These are incredibly rare, and the risk of invading them is never worth it. Even trying to perform therapy on such people is dangerous. Their figments can sometimes overpower a witch. There are cases of them breaking the shackle with sheer force of will, and even some cases of them shaping the witch's mind in their own image. Curiosity is the only reason to ever visit one of these minds, and it is a curiosity that some have paid dearly for. Right, so the question is, does Mayu have a fantastic mind or an aberrant mind? Oh my god, we're finally done with the reading. I'm gonna save here.